that was one of the issues, and we saw that early on. For example, there are a number of trees that, although they're still standing, if you look at the root base, you will see that the roots have lifted. And once the root system is compromised, at that particular point, that tree becomes a danger because in a stiff wind, it could go over. And we're finding a number of those trees. I mean, we've cut down about 11 trees right now that were still standing, but in our opinion presented a danger because of either the way they were leaning or we could see movement in the ground around the root base. And that kind of tells you that that tree is pretty much not savable.
So what's going to happen with all that wood that's piled outside the caretaker's house, nice and neatly stacked out there?
I honestly don't know. I haven't even addressed that issue. I mean, some of that I think is hardwood. Most of the trees that went down are pines and cedars. They're really not good for burning in fireplaces, so 99% of the wood had to be trashed. We had a couple of hardwood trees that perhaps could be used for firewood.
Okay.
All right, and then if I could just extend this one more, because it's not really Crawford Park, but it's 10 Pearl Street. And I think many of you know that this was a problem that simply was exposed because of the storm. This particular wall right here, no,
it was FEMA eligible damage.
It certainly is possible. It's a question of what can qualify. Again, we have an architect came to look at it, and I could just tell you, for example, the masonry was wet and saturated in some locations, where the mortar joints were deteriorated in select locations. What we've experienced here is that this particular wall and, frankly, the entire building needs a repointing. The exterior envelope of this building is not good. The roof, for example, the brand-new roof you spent money on worked beautifully. However, we have capstones on the top of the parapet walls that don't have the appropriate flashing. We have window lintels that were not properly installed.
I think Mr. Nowotnik, as we discussed, we need to get a capital budget pulled together.
Yes.
I don't think, well, certainly, I don't know. In the years I've been following the board, there's been no capital budget. And we need to pull together a capital budget. I think if I look at the beach, we probably haven't had any monies invested for 50 years. I understand you're going to actually get an architect in to come up with a capital budget for us, or how are we going to be doing this?
Yeah, we're going to try and at least speak with at least 2 architects if we can to try and get some semblance of pricing, but the reality is we need to bring a professional in to evaluate these kinds of things and put those numbers together.
I presume we have to put this to RFP?
No, you do not. That's considered a professional service, but I still feel that we certainly should take a look at least 2 architects.
Considering the amount of money or the size, the scope of work that we're talking about, even though it doesn't fall under an RFP, we still need to do due diligence to make sure that that we're bringing in the right people here.
I agree.
And I would suggest we get an engineer in. As opposed to an architect?
Well, typically what you wind up doing is they come in pairs. All right, they don't work independently. So what will happen is as we bring in an architect, the architect becomes the project manager, but they bring in an engineer along with them.
But you need an engineer to determine the useful life remaining of the existing building or whatever, and only an engineer would be able to do that. And they could tell you, for instance, that wall has a useful life of 0 years or 15 years, and then you have to replace it at a certain period of time.
Sure.
And that's integral to developing a capital budget.
Right.
Okay.
So, do we want, how much, Bob, do you have any, Councilman Nearest, do you have any sense of what something like this would cost?
No, I don't.
I mean, I think, what did it cost us at Rytown Park, Mr. Nowotnik?
Well, at Rytown Park, you had a slightly different scope of work, and it was also, that was a historic restoration. I think here we're not subject to any kind of historic restoration rules. But to give you a frame of reference, to develop a scope of work just for 10 Pearl Street, just this building, is roughly about $15,000. So if we wanted to look at the assets of Rytown as a whole, you're looking at the William Street Garage, you're looking at 10 Pearl Street, you're looking at Crawford Park, and you're looking at Rytown Park. I would tell you that you're looking at a number, if you wanted to do the job correctly, $60,000 to $70,000.
Oh, my goodness.
If you wanted to do the job.
Yeah, well, what if we want to do the job?
I think that's cheap.
Cheap?
Yes.
You see the extent of the damage of the building? It's extensive.
No, this is just to analyze the needs.
I understand, but I mean, it's a lot of need. This building is in horrible, horrible shape.
Well, I understand
It's
that.
an old building that has not been maintained for
Forever.
If you want to look at a rule of
the building
thumb,
built, do we know?
I don't know.
1948 was the actual base building. The first 2 floors were built, and then around 1979, the 3rd floor was added. So you're looking at the 3rd floor already being 30 years old. You're looking at the other 2 floors being more like 50 years old. And the infrastructure shows it. If you went down into the basement, I think you would see the kinds of structures that we're dealing with. As a rule of thumb, just to give you an idea, the typical feasibility analysis, if you will, or needs analysis, will run you 10% of your job. Now, if you'll remember, we had a number of somewhere around $6 to $7 million down at Rytown Park for the beach pavilion. Those are the kinds of numbers you're looking at.
Well, look, I think that we're 2 years into this, a little bit more. I'm very pleased with the number of things we've done. One thing we haven't really focused on is the infrastructure. And I think we need to do that, unfortunately. And I think it's been... I don't think any of these buildings have 50 years has been any investment in any of these buildings, any of our facilities for 50 years, if that. Now, it's a good time to put together a capital budget. We have interest rates at all-time lows. It would be a stimulus to the economy. So, I mean, if we had a $10 million program, we were running some numbers the other day, it probably cost us about, depending on as much, anyway, $300,000 to $500,000 a year. Obviously, that puts a damper in our zero tax pledge. But I think we need to, give some real consideration. So just again, help me through this. So we're going to put out an RFP for engineering. Well, I say RFP. We're not going to do an RFP. We're going to put out a bid to some engineering and architectural firms.
Yes.
It's a bid, right? So
it's a request for proposal.
Request for proposal.
All right. We put a skeleton outline together, identifying the properties, identifying what outcomes we're looking for.
Right.
And at that particular point, they'll come in. This is a standard process,
right,
Mr. Supervisor.
This is
very routine in the business.
It was. It's a professional services.
It's a request for proposals for professional services. So,
right. Now, my question is, we have one architect that's worked extremely well with us. What happens if they were to come in a bit higher than somebody else? Can we choose?
It's within your discretion, yeah.
Oh, it is? Okay, good.
But it's good to have a range to get a sense of where you're at. But it's not a formal bid. It's a request for proposal.
That's what I was going to say. Okay, great.
The other piece of this, Bishop, and just make sure that I'm thinking the correct way. This person's going to come in and give us a bid on all of these components. We're going to prioritize the component, and we're going to say we're going to pull the trigger on 10 Pearl Street because that's the component that's most important now.
No, I have to clarify, and I'm sorry, but there's a technical aspect. You're saying, you're using the term bid. This is not a bid. What they are going to come in with is they're going to come in with a professional evaluation
All right, so they're gonna
and
say
a
that-
recommendation that this particular, let's say replacing the windows, will cost you approximately X. They are not bidding on the job.